Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx communities across the Americas, and today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Arcelia Gutiérrez is Assistant Professor of Latinx Studies in the Department of Hispanic Studies at the University of Kentucky. Valerie Gruest, a graduate student in the program of Media, Technology and Society at Northwestern and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Arcelia in just a minute. But before we do that, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. Was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Valerie will tell us more about Arcelia's research and career in just a minute. Then Arcelia will deliver her seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Valerie will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Valerie, the screen is all yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pablo, thank you very much for having me as a moderator for this seminar. It is an absolute honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Arcelia Gutiérrez holds a BA in Literatures and Spanish, Latin American Studies, with a minor in Management Science from the University of California, and a doctorate in Romance Languages and Literatures from the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on Latinx media advocacy and activism from the 1980s to the present. She explores how Latinx media activists navigated processes of deregulation and neoliberalization and the strategies they've used to push for the inclusion of Latinxes in television, film, and radio. Relying on archival materials, in-depth interviews, participant observation, and textual analysis, she offers a genealogy of the efforts made by major media advocacy organizations over the decades, from protests against stereotypes in film and threat of filing a petition to deny based on equal employment opportunity rules violations in the 80s, consumer boycotts in the 90s, the creation of professionalization and funding entities in the early 2000s, to digital activism in the last decade. In exploring these strategies, Dr. Gutiérrez also outlines the ways in which media activists have weaponized Latinidad as a discursive device for leverage in their fight for inclusion in the media industries. Dr. Gutiérrez is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies at the University of Kentucky. She serves as a co-chair of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, Latino-Latina Caucus. She also served as curator of the Latin America exhibit for Unlocking the Airwaves, Revitalizing an Early Public and Educational Radio Collection project, a comprehensive online collection of early educational public radio content from the National Association of Educational Broadcasters. She has also organized several panels in the field of Latinx media activism, advocacy, and mediascapes. She is also author of several journal articles and book reviews, including Situating Representation as a Form of Erasure, Oscars So White, Black Twitter, and Latinx Twitter, Assessing the State of Latinxes in Television and Film, and Sí, Ella Puede, The Rhetorical Legacy of Dolores Huerta and the United Farm Workers, among many others. In addition, over the years, Arcelia has been an active member of diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. We are so honored to have Dr. Gutiérrez today to share with us her knowledge and experience. Thank you so much. The screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for that introduction. I'm incredibly honored to be part of this seminar series. And I want to say a thank you also to Pablo and Mora Matasi for the incredible work they've been doing with the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Also, thank you to Dr. Angara Valdivia for recommending my work when she was here last quarter. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen now so that you can see my presentation. And all right, so let's get started. The title of my presentation for today is Competing Ethno-Racialized Counterpublics, #OscarsSoWhite, Black Twitter, and Latinx Twitter. So let's get started. Appalled by the predominantly white slate of nominees for the 2015 Academy Awards, activist April Rain tweeted on January 15, 2015 that #OscarsSoWhite, they asked to touch my hair. Her tweet and the hashtag went viral, with Twitter users satirically poking fun at the Oscars' lack of diversity. By 2016, Rain's hashtag turned into a movement when actors Jada Pinkett Smith and Will Smith, director Spike Lee, and Reverend Al Sharpton called for a boycott of and demonstrations against the Oscars and its telecast. Despite the hashtag's inclusivity of all ethno-racial minoritized groups and its wide call for diversity in Hollywood, some non-Black Latinx believe the hashtag excluded their community by centering the Black experience. When discussing issues of media diversity with actor, writer, and director Yareli Arismendi, who is known for her film A Day Without a Mexican, she stated, quote, "This whole Oscars so white, I want to do Oscars so blind. They don't see us Latinos at all," end quote. And statistics about the motion picture industry support her claim, with Latinx comprising only 4.9% of film roles, despite constituting 18% of the US population. Her words prompted me to question how Latinx have responded to the visibility of social media campaigns and movements, such as #OscarsSoWhite, that are spearheaded by Black activists and media makers. What discourses have Latinx deployed on social media to justify their demands for inclusion in the media industries? And how do notions of competition, coalition building, and solidarity operate between various ethno-racial groups in digital media activism? To answer these questions, I turn to Twitter, a site where contemporary forms of digital media activism transpire, and I trace the encounters between two Twitter assemblages, Black Twitter and Latinx Twitter. Andre Brock defines Black Twitter as, quote, "Twitter's mediation of Black cultural identity, and as an online gathering, not quite a community, of Twitter users who identify as Black and employ Twitter features to perform Black discourses, share Black cultural commonplace, and build social affinities," end quote. Following this theorization, I define Latinx Twitter as the discursive performance of a pan-ethnic Latino X identity on Twitter, formed through the connections, networks, and engagement of Latinx users on the platform. In this talk, I explore moments with Black Twitter and Latinx Twitter crystallize as counterpublics and come into conflict with one another. We can understand counterpublics as discursive arenas in which subordinated groups express their interests and needs to challenge their exclusion from dominant public spheres. I conduct qualitative discourse analysis of 3 hashtags, #OscarsSoWhite, #NotYourMule, and #OscarsSoWhite&Black, that arose as Black Twitter and Latinx Twitter clashed over media diversity discourses between 2016 and 2018. In exploring the above mentioned hashtags and the interaction between Latinx and Black Twitter, I analyze the ways in which Latinx engage in media activism and the interracial tensions that arise in digital media activism. I argue that Latinx Twitter relies on a discourse of invisibility, a critique of Black hypervisibility in media activism, and the notion of a white and Black racial binary that allegedly marginalizes the struggles and needs of Latinx. Latinx Twitter uses these discourses in order to create a counterpublic and to legitimize its demands for inclusion in the media industries. In deploying these rhetorics, Latinx Twitter not only places blame on African Americans for Latinx invisibility in Hollywood, but also reproduces invisibility through the erasure of Afro-Latinidad, or Black Latinx, and partakes in anti-Blackness. Building on Jürgen Habermas's notion of the public sphere, Nancy Fraser and Catherine Squire's theorization of counterpublics, Sarah Jackson and Brooke Foucault-Wells' frameworks of Twitter network counterpublics, Sanjay Sharma's notion of racialized hashtags, and Natalia Molina's framework of race as a relational concept, I explore interactions between counterpublics on Twitter. Given that ethno-racial publics don't operate in a vacuum and don't only interact exclusively with the white mainstream public sphere, exploring the clashes between marginalized publics allows us to understand inter and intra-ethno-racial tensions in the study of social movements and race relations in the US. I therefore propose the notion of competing ethno-racialized counterpublics as a way to explore how race and ethnicity operate relationally in the US and how competition among marginalized groups impacts media activism. As Natalia Molina and Daniel Martinez-Hossein suggest, studying race relationally encourages us to move away from exclusively exploring marginalized groups in relation to whiteness and through a white, non-white binary, and instead to explore how group-based racial constructions are formed in relation not only to whiteness, but also to other devalued and marginalized groups. While my focus is on dominant discourses arising from points of contention between Black Twitter and Latinx Twitter surrounding Oscar So White, I want to recognize that these counterpublics don't operate as neat categories and don't always have to be in competition with one another. In fact, I believe that ethno-racial Twitter engagements have the capacity to help shift competing counterpublics into coalitional counterpublics. So how do we begin to define and theorize Latinx Twitter? To do that, it's important to first define Latinidad. And here I rely on Frances Aparicio, who views Latino, Latina, Latinx as a site of, quote, competing authenticities and paradigms of identity that together and in conflict with each other constitute the heterogeneous experiences of various Latino and national groups, end quote. In theorizing Latinidad, Aparicio not only calls for an analysis of vertical power differentials between Latinx and the white Anglo-dominant society, but also for an examination of the, quote, horizontal scope of power differences, conflicts, tensions, and affinities between and among Latinos of diverse national identities, end quote, what she refers to as horizontal hierarchies. Relying on this definition allows us to understand Latinidad not only as a pan-ethnic identity deployed in terms of political necessity and expedience against Anglo society, but also as, quote, processes by which diverse Latinos interact with, dominate, and transculturate each other, end quote. Keeping these nuances in mind and following Andre Brock and Sarah Florini's theorization of Black Twitter, I define Latinx Twitter as the discursive performance of a pan-ethnic Latino X identity on Twitter, formed through the connections, networks, and engagement of Latinx users on the platform. Similar to how Latinidad is constructed by various ethnic and racial subgroups, Latinx Twitter is comprised of sub-ethno-racial Twitters, such as Chicano Twitter, Boricua Twitter, Afro-Latinx Twitter, Latinx-based Indigenous Twitter, and Central American Twitter. Latinx Twitter is formed as a digital race assemblage and a counterpublic when these various Twitter subgroups partake in moments of pan-ethnic engagement, often through pan-ethnic racialized hashtags, to explore the experiences, interests, and needs of the wider Latinx counterpublic. By theorizing Latinx in this way, we can examine Latinidad, 1, as a virtual digital construct, 2, as a pan-ethnic construct deployed on Twitter for political power, and 3, as an expression of the horizontal hierarchies, everyday experiences, and informal activity of Latinx across ethnic and racial lines. We can see Latinx Twitter's visibility and existence as a counterpublic, for example, through pan-ethnic racialized hashtags such as hashtag growing up Latino, growing up Hispanic, not my abuela or not mi abuela, referring to Hillary Clinton, Hispanics break the internet, embrace the Latinx, dignidad literaria, and one of the most recent and more popular ones, hashtag boycott Goya. Other times, however, Latinx Twitter is formed and made visible not necessarily through hashtags, but rather through trending topics, events, or controversies relevant to Latinx. Such events have included Donald Trump's racist discourse and the nativist hate crimes that has fomented in the US, tensions over the use of the label Latinx, when former NBC Nightly News anchor Tom Brokaw described Hispanics as predominantly Spanish-speaking and unassimilable, Beto O'Rourke and Cory Booker's use of the Spanish language during one of the Democratic Party's 2019 primary debates, which was seen as Hispandering, and Spanish-born recording artist Arcelia winning both a Latin Grammy and the 2019 VMA's Best Latin category when she is in fact not Latina. Not only do I place emphasis on how dominant narratives are created by a counterpublic, but also the internal fragmentations and contestations within Latinx Twitter. Therefore, while at times Latinx Twitter can be made more visible and become solidified as a racial assemblage through pan-ethnic discursive engagements, it's also fragmented due to differences in language practices of Latinx users, such as English language, Spanish language, bilingualism, and so on, and contestations over what comprises Latinidad. We know that Latinidad as a pan-ethnic construct relies on homogenization to paint Latinos as a collective, unified body, thereby erasing significant differences such as race, class, region, culture, religion, language practices, and citizenship status among its ethnic subgroups. While pan-ethnicity tactically relies on the discursive construction of Latinx as a monolith, Latinx in actuality are heterogeneous and their interests varied and often in competition and conflict with one another. Therefore, exploring Latinx Twitter and its sub-ethno-racial Twitters allows us to understand the discursive construction and the splintering of pan-ethnicity on social media. These Twitter subgroups function as counterpublics themselves, expressing the experiences and interests of these ethnic and racial subgroups, at times being in cohesion with the wider pan-ethnic interests of Latinx Twitter, and at times being in competition. This can be seen, for example, through Central American US-based diasporic Twitter users who form Central American Twitter, and how they challenge their erasure from and marginalization within Latinx identity and history. Central American Twitter thus contests what it views as a Mexican-American Chicano hegemony in Latinidad, while also using the social media platform to discursively center US-based Central American identity. And here I give you examples of some of these sub-ethno-racial Twitters and some of the hashtags or trending topics within these Twitters. So for example, you have Central American Twitter. Some of the hashtags that it uses include hashtag Central American Twitter, I am CENTAM, Salvi War Trauma, Prohibido Olvidar SD, and CENTAM Studies. Indigenous Twitter, Latinx-based Indigenous Twitter also falls part of the broader Indigenous, pan-ethnic Indigenous Twitter. So some of these hashtags include hashtag Indigenous Twitter, hashtag Indigenous AF, Abolish Columbus Day, Oaxacan Twitter, and also discourses surrounding Afro-Indigeneity. For Chicano Twitter, hashtags include Chicano Twitter, Chicano Power, Viva la Raza, and topics that really brought Chicano Twitter to the forefront or helped it manifest and become visible, included the use of Latinx. A lot of sectors of Chicano Twitter are really against this label. And also the renaming of the student organization, the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano Chicana de Aztlán. For Boricua Twitter or Puerto Rican Twitter, you see hashtags such as Ricky renuncia to oust its governor, Hurricane Maria, Paro Nacional PR, and cancel the debt. And Afro-Latinx Twitter has used hashtags such as Garifuna Twitter, so talking about Afro-Indigenous groups, Afro-Latinx Studies, Las Vidas Negras Importan, and discussions surrounding topics such as anti-Blackness, cultural appropriation, race versus ethnicity. And I give you broad categories here, but they're not rigid, and that there are intersections between these sub-ethno-racial Twitters and the hashtags or topics that they center on. For example, we can take Garifuna Twitter right here under Afro-Latinx Twitter, but it also falls under Central American Twitter, under Indigenous Twitter, and even under Black Twitter. And here I give you 5 sub-ethno-racial Twitter categories. But more research can explore the dynamics of diasporic Twitter, such as Dominican Twitter, Cuban American Twitter, Venezuelan Twitter, and the intersections between sub-ethno-racial Twitters and gender, sexuality, politics, etc. While my intention is not to paint Black Twitter as a monolith, and there's research that discusses this, it's important to underscore that these competing sub-ethno-racial Twitters make Latinx Twitter not as easily assembled and visible to the mainstream when compared to Black Twitter. When it is amalgamated and made visible, however, the dominant pan-ethnic discourses that arise from Latinx Twitter construct a particular imagined community that reproduces horizontal hierarchies and flattened Latinidad. This is revealed through dominant Latinx pan-ethnic discourses that erase Afro-Latinx and engage in anti-Blackness, a practice that mirrors the anti-Blackness of Latinidad. Here I rely on the work of Paul Joseph Lopez Oro, who argues that mestizaje, or the process of cultural hybridity through biological race mixture that resulted from Spanish conquest and colonialism in Latin America, resulted in, quote, Latin American forms of nationalism being predicated on the notion that mestizaje has eliminated racial hierarchy and fostered an inclusive sense of nationhood, end quote. Nonetheless, as Lopez Oro and Juliet Hooker suggest, behind this myth of racial democracy lies an inherent and explicit project of whitening through race mixture or blanqueamiento that has, 1, served to legitimize racial hierarchy and discrimination in Latin America, 2, posed Blackness as alien to mestizaje, and 3, laid the foundation for anti-Blackness. The notion of mestizaje and anti-Blackness, coupled with the location of Blackness at the bottom of the racial hierarchy in the US, is thus inherited and mediated through US constructions of Latinidad, articulated through what Ginetta Candelario calls a sort of racial code switching, in which both Latin American and US race systems are engaged, subverted, and sustained by US-based Latinx. Furthermore, as Miriam Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores outline, the construction of Latinidad as a pan-ethnic group identity and governmental category beginning in the late 1970s resulted in the pitting of Latinx against African Americans in the quest for numerical supremacy and resources. It also led to Latinx identity increasingly being defined as non-Black and anti-Black, and Latinidad's corporeality of brownness, right? So we can assume Latinos must all be brown. In embracing this separation and binary racialization, Monica Gossin reminds us that marginalized groups have played into strategies of divide and conquer that reinscribe white dominance and that set the stakes, the rules of engagement, and often the outcomes for groups of color. Similarly, to achieve visibility and power, Latinx Twitter relies on homogenization and the flattening of difference to construct pan-ethnic discourses. This results in a dominant representation of Latinidad that favors white and mestizo Latinx while erasing Black Latinx, thereby producing a colorblind and race-blind illusion that in actuality engages in anti-Blackness. The legacy of anti-Blackness, this legacy of anti-Blackness is what propels Latinx Twitter's dominant discourses to reproduce anti-Blackness and to be in a constant, contentious, competitive relationship with Black Twitter. Moreover, this places Black Latinx in a liminal position on Twitter, on the one hand, not fully recognized as part of Latinx Twitter, and on the other, not seen as fully belonging to Black Twitter. The discourses Latinx Twitter deployed surrounding hashtag OscarsSoWhite exemplify this racial history and legacy. So now we'll move on to exploring the discourses surrounding the 3 hashtags that I outlined in the introduction. Hashtag Oscars So White initially served to communicate the experiences of Black exclusion in the Academy Awards and the motion picture industry, and as a way to challenge this industry for inclusion. It therefore functioned as a racialized hashtag that fomented a counterpublic narrative by communicating and legitimizing Black marginalization in Hollywood and challenging the mainstream public sphere to address issues of media diversity. The impact of the movement can be seen in the 88th Academy Awards, when comedian Chris Rock was tapped to host the awards ceremony held on February 28, 2016. Rock began the show by addressing the Oscars So White controversy, the history of exclusion of African Americans in the Oscars nominations, and in particular, the lack of Black nominees during that year's awards. While Rock justifiably centered the exclusion of African Americans in Oscars nominations, given that this group was leading the charge against the Academy Awards, his monologue nonetheless faced criticism from non-Black people of color. While Black Twitter used the hashtag to critique, in the words of a Black Twitter user, the quote, white supremacist system and the institution of whiteness that excludes people of color narratives in film, end quote, non-Black people of color on Twitter questioned the hashtag's inclusivity and foregrounded issues of invisibility in the media. The hashtag placed Latinx Twitter and Asian American Twitter in conflict with Black Twitter, thus creating a competition between ethno-racialized counterpublics. For example, critics on Twitter accused Rock, along with hashtag Oscars So White, of framing issues of media diversity as a Black and white binary that thereby invisibilized the existence of non-Black minoritized groups. The hashtag therefore also articulated inter and intraracial dynamics and tensions in contemporary media activism, centering on discourses of racial competition, coalition, and belonging. Latinx Twitter's responses to Chris Rock's monologue are indicative of these tensions. For example, Latino LA, a user-generated content page about Latino stories, news, and events, tweeted critiques of Rock's speech the evening of the Academy Awards. And they stated, Chris Rock forgets its Hollywood Brown Out 2 Brown Ribbon campaign, and some see Oscars 2016 diversity and inclusion as just a Black-white issue. These tweets refer to the Brown Ribbon campaign spearheaded by actress Eva Longoria that encouraged Oscars attendees to wear brown ribbons to bring awareness to the lack of Latinx representation in film. Echoing these sentiments, a Latina tweeted, "Diversity is not just Black and white, there are a lot of nationalities not represented." Moreover, another Latina Twitter user highlighted the perceived invisibility of Latinx in the motion picture industry and digital media activism by stating, this is here in the middle, "What are we, chopped liver? We must not allow anyone to forget us and all that we bring to any and every endeavor." This claim, taking this claim further, Latino LA boldly responded to the tweet by arguing that hashtag Oscars So White excludes Latinos too, at Chris Rock knows that. These tweets are indicative of other discussions that were taking place on Twitter that argued that Latinx were invisibilized in Hollywood and in discourses about media diversity, and also demonstrated a sense of resentment in regard to the perceived visibility of African Americans. Others went further by demonstrating anti-Blackness as a response to the visibility and advances African Americans had begun to make due to their activism. For example, a well-known Latino artist tweeted on the night of the 2016 Oscars telecast that they should call these the Black Presenter Awards. These discourses culminated in 2 posts that placed non-Black Twitter counterpublics in tension with Black Twitter and sparked clashes and discussions about inclusion, racial formations, activism, labor, and solidarity. Huffington Post Latino Voices tweeted to Chris Rock saying, "We want Black actors to get the same opportunity at Chris Rock, but what about the Latinos? We want that too." Here, Huffington Post Latino Voices misdirects its critique as if Rock controls the opportunities Latinx are afforded in the industry and as if it's his responsibility to lobby for Latinx representation. In a similar vein, Filipino journalist and immigrant rights activist Jose Antonio Vargas tweeted on that same night, "When will at Chris Rock bring up Latino, Asian, Middle Eastern, Native American actors and opportunity?" These tweets mirror rhetoric that has historically been used by Latinx civic organizations and activists who perceive the civil rights movement and its legacy foremost as a white-black binary. As Cristina Beltran, and she just published a fabulous new book, please check it out. As she has argued, quote, "Emotionally, the history of Black politics has tended to produce a potent combination of envy, inspiration, and resentment among Latino civic elites, with Black activism serving as the racial prototype for how to demand power and resources at the federal level," end quote. Latinx leaders have therefore voiced a combination of competition and emulation in expressing their desire that Latinx acquire recognition and national standing comparable to African Americans. Importantly, these critiques on Twitter overlooked Chris Rock's allyship to Latinx when he condemned their exclusion from the media industries and characterized their treatment as indicative of a slave state in LA during a 2014 interview with The Hollywood Reporter. Nonetheless, Vargas and the Huffington Post tweets didn't go unanswered, triggering responses from Black Twitter and allies and a clash between competing ethno-racialized counterpublics. Significantly, writer Mickey Kendall created the hashtag #NotYourMule as a retort to the backlash Rock and April Rain received from non-Black counterpublics. Her set of tweets regarding the hashtag functioned as an indictment of non-Black people of color who don't act in solidarity with the Black community, but wish to reap the rewards of Black activism. Kendall especially underscored how the backlash Rock and Rain received from non-Black people was indicative of internalized racism within marginalized ethno-racial groups. She importantly also reminded non-Black counterpublics that, quote, "the so-called Black-white binary wasn't created by Black people," end quote, and urged Twitter users to have a conversation about racial dynamics in America and to recognize that institutional racism is the root of oppression, not the Black community. Kendall also addressed issues of invisibility and anti-Blackness in the Latinx community, arguing that if Latinx were so concerned with visibility and mainstream representation, then they should no longer remain silent about the lack of Afro-Latinx in telenovelas, as seen in this tweet right here. Here, the writer calls attention to the hypocrisy of Latinx calling for increased media representation when they are complicit in the exclusion and marginalization of Black Latinx in the Spanish language television industry. This critique thus calls into question what Latinx mean when they advocate for Latinx representation, a type of advocacy that perpetuates a dominant representation of Latinidad by erasing Blackness and indigeneity within this pan-ethnic identity. In addition, Kendall maintained that anti-Blackness equated to non-Black people of color complaining about the work that Black people do and then demanding that they get the benefit first. This comment highlighted the labor that goes into social movements, underscoring that the advances made for Black representation were, as she says, a result of Black labor and Black sacrifice. Kendall's hashtag therefore interrogated the expectation that Black people bear the burden and the risk for all, and she reminded non-Black people of color that Black people don't know other communities' free labor. Instead, she called for these groups to do the work of demanding representation and inclusion, stating that, quote, "Black hypervisibility isn't a license to expect us to do all the work and take all the risk. You want something, step up," end quote. The interactions between these competing ethno-racialized counterpublics and this hashtag sparked discussions on Black Twitter about race, social movements, and co-optation. So for example, a Twitter user here says, "Casual reminder, Black people are at the bottom of racial power structures worldwide. Think critically before demanding labor. Hashtag #NotYourMule." Another one says, "Folks forever trying to co-opt the movement that they put no work in." And April Rain, the creator of Oscar So White, says, "What you won't do is show up late to the party, demand cake, and then ask why it isn't your favorite flavor." Not only did the hashtag center the labor that falls on Black activists to spearhead social movements, It also forced Latinx Twitter to reckon with these issues. Particularly, Chris Rock's monologue and hashtag Not Your Mule brought to the forefront intra-ethnic conflicts on Latinx Twitter, forcing this counterpublic to have conversations about anti-Blackness within its own community and discussions about racial solidarity and activist efforts. For example, author Daniel Jose Alder says, when will non-Black people of color stand up collectively to the anti-Blackness in our own communities and stop demanding to be centered? And Afro Latina on Twitter here says, I've watched novelas my entire life and can count on one hand Black, Asian, Latinos in leading roles, hardly a whisper of protest. You won't see much Indigenous, Asian, Black representation on Univision or Telemundo either. And lastly, a reporter here says, fellow non-Black people of color, tonight we shut up and listen, right? And listen to the lessons emerging from this hashtag, thereby, using these narratives as an opportunity to learn about racial solidarity. Despite appeals from Black Twitter and some Latinx users to stop comparing Latinx visibility to that of the Black community, Latinx Twitter continued to largely frame its counterpublic narrative as that of an invisibilized minority kept down by a white-Black racial binary. This manifested itself in the hashtag Oscars So White and Black, which has resurfaced in 2016, 2017, and 2018 during Oscar season. The hashtag serves as another example of non-Black counterpublics demonstrating their frustration with the representational status quo in the media and resentment towards the Black community. The racialized hashtag textually embodies the Black and white racial dichotomy non-Black people of color believe helps reinforce their invisibility and marginalization in US English language media. The hashtag also implies that African Americans have overcome systemic racial discrimination in the media and have achieved visibility and power equal to white Americans, and somehow are therefore now complicit in the marginalization of other minoritized groups. And so this hashtag sparked another encounter between non-Black counterpublics and Black Twitter. So you see, for example, people here saying Oscars so diverse this year. Nope, Oscars so white and Black. Oscars so white and Black, another disappointing year for Latino actors at the Oscars 2018. Only 3 Latino Americans have ever won an acting Oscar. And so diversity is limited to Blacks being nominated. Latino actors need not apply. Black Twitter and allies responded to this hashtag through some of these narratives. My understanding is that the point of Oscars So Black and White is to chastise the Blacks for hogging all the color representation. Is that correct? Is that what we're doing? Someone else says non-Black people of color showing their whole butts with this Oscars So Black and White. Oscars So White was and still is about the white establishment keeping folks out. Black people aren't keeping y'all out. Black supremacy isn't a thing in the US of A. Someone else here says, positioning the lack of Asian and Latinx diversity as Oscars So White and Black just all the way shot any valid point they had in the foot. Because now the folks who would have amplified them will be dragging them all day. And a conversation that needs to be had about the fact that Asian and Latinx recognition in entertainment is super sparse is about to be drowned out in the conversation about covert and overt anti-Blackness among non-Black people of color. These interactions between competing counterpublic narratives have led Latinx Twitter to interrogate the dominant representations and exclusions created within Latinidad and how to engage in media activism. One of the fiercest critics of Latinx Twitter's media diversity discourses is content creator and podcaster Ruben Angel, known for their co-hosted podcast, Bitter Brown Femmes. Ruben has criticized the hypocrisy of some of these discourses, specifically how in Latinx demands for media representation and inclusion, they reproduce the marginalization of Black Latinx. Ruben asked, where is the hashtag to include Afro-Latinx in English language shows, in that Latinx and in telenovelas, and argues that it doesn't exist because, quote, this isn't about representation for all of us, just the same mestizo white BS we're accustomed to in Latin American media, end quote. In deploying Latinx as the invisible minority oppressed by a white and Black racial binary, Media activists thereby reproduce colonialist Latin American racial power structures that center the phenotypically white and mestizo and further invisibilize and marginalize Black Latinx. Echoing Ruben's assertion, another Latinx Twitter user condemned her community by stating, "Time and time again, I see non-Black Chicanx commenting on the progress Black people have made, not with admiration or inspiration, but with resentment. Oscar So White and Black is yet another example. Maybe someday we'll realize that our progress must be achieved with our labor." Only when we begin to dismantle our anti-Blackness and our complicity in upholding white supremacy can we stop pitting Latinx representation against Black representation and stop demanding that Black people bear the burden for activism. Perhaps then we can shift our focus to holding the white-dominated media industries accountable and to start imagining a future beyond asking for a seat at a table that wasn't built for us. To conclude, I've demonstrated how Latinx Twitter relies on a discourse of invisibility, a critique of Black hypervisibility in media activism, and the notion of a white and Black racial binary that allegedly marginalizes the struggles and needs of Latinx. By exploring the moments when ethno-racialized counterpublics are in conflict and competition, not only can we explore how marginalized groups position themselves vis-a-vis whiteness in the media industries, but also how they position themselves in relation to one another. Although these clashes produce tense, confrontational interactions, they also have the potential to shift the discursive underpinning from competition to dialogue, thereby critiquing anti-Blackness, whiteness, and power, and to engage in solidarity. As Daniel Martinez Hossein and Natalia Molina underscore, quote, "If racism, colonialism, and white supremacy are understood as relational in their logic and operations, effective anti-racisms must also operate from a relational premise and can yield new relations of solidarity and horizons of justice," end quote. While there's considerable room for growth in how Latinx engage in digital media activism in terms of racial coalitional work and the inclusion of Black Latinx, the potential for relational anti-racisms can already be seen as a result of clashes between ethno-racialized counterpublics. For example, sectors of Latinx Twitter have continuously condemned the actions of Latina actor Gina Rodriguez, who is widely viewed by Black Twitter as being anti-Black. In addition, discourses emerging from Latinx Twitter have also been critical of Jennifer Lopez and Shakira's decision to headline the 2020 Super Bowl after Black artists had refused to perform as a way to show solidarity to Colin Kaepernick, the former NFL football player who has been blacklisted for his activism against police brutality. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter racial uprisings during the summer of 2020, many Latinx have faced a moment of racial reckoning by addressing Afro-Latinx erasure and anti-Blackness in their communities and challenging Latinx whataboutisms as it pertains to discussions about police brutality against Black people. Speaking for myself, as someone that was raised and socialized to adopt anti-Black attitudes and who's worked and continues to work on overcoming this, I want to encourage us non-Black Latinx to interrogate who we center and who we erase and or marginalize when we talk about Latinx representation. My hope is that such continued engagement can transform anti-racist rhetorics into dominant discourses emanating from Latinx Twitter, thus helping to redress Latinidad's anti-Blackness and recasting Black and Latinx Twitter's relationship from competing counterpublics to coalitional counterpublics. A coalitional relationship would also help shift individualized solutions to systemic racism, such as Latinx Twitter's misguided critique of Chris Rock, to collective online political mobilization that could help press for structural change and challenge white supremacy. And I'll close by leaving you with names of scholars doing amazing work on Black Latinidad. Also, if you're interested in learning more about Latinx and Indigenous erasure in Latinx media and in English language media generally, follow the work of Amarilis Rodriguez. She's the last one listed right here, and that's her handle for Twitter. And she's also on Clubhouse. If you're on Clubhouse, follow her. And she recently started hosting panels or rooms about these topics. So please give her a follow, and I will stop there. and toss it back to Valerie for the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Gutierrez. That was incredible. And we are receiving a lot of questions in the Q&A. So we can start with a question from Pablo Zavala. Pablo asks, I'd like to ask about this mutual exclusivity between Latinx and Black Twitter. Do you see this opposition existing only in digital activism? And Pablo includes that the reason I ask is because in BLM, there's more of an in-street activism, including yard signs, protests, and he has seen this in backgrounds that Black and brown bodies matter. So in other words, while not explicitly engaging in these cases, especially focusing on the 1960s in the United States, what is this dichotomy that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, I do want to clarify, right, that it's not a rigid dichotomy even on Twitter, right? So we think of Afro Latinx Twitter or Black Latinx Twitter, they fit in both, right? Like they live in that hyphen, in that middle space. So there isn't that clear-cut dichotomy, but I will say that dominant discourses emanating from Latinx Twitter, right, tend to reproduce that separation. And I would say that that's also looking at demographics, right? In the US, the largest ethnic demographic for Latinx is comprised of Mexican Americans, right? Like by large numbers. And if we look at racial hierarchies in Mexico, it doesn't tend to recognize the presence of Afro-Mexicans until very recently, right? And so the conception that Mexican people and Chicanos form of what Latinidad is and what Blackness is seen as separate, right? But if you go back to places like, especially in Puerto Rico or with like Cuban communities, right, more Caribbean-based identities, looking at the Young Lords, for example, during the 60s in New York and in Chicago, they were very much, they didn't believe in that separation, right? There were Afro-Latinx leaders within these organizations. So I think it's also geographically based and numerically in terms of who gets to create the dominant discourses because of numbers, right?
Yes, thank you. And we have another question. Orquídea asks, what is the relationship between Latinx Twitter and Latinx American Twitter, if that exists, when it comes to anti-Blackness and representation?
Between Latinx Twitter and Latinx American?
Yes, it is seen as, if that exists, if that's seen differently, just the Latinx Twitter or Latin American Twitter, if that exists.
Latin American.
Yeah.
Yes, got it. Oh, that's a really good question. I haven't delved so much into like Latin American Twitter, right? Like my algorithm and who I follow isn't as tapped into much of that. But I would assume, right, that some of the same rhetoric, right, is reproduced given colonial legacies and racial hierarchies in Latin America, where I don't think there would be as much of an acknowledgement of Black Afrodescendientes, right, within Latin America, and the same anti-Blackness, right? And if we think about Latin American media and the dominant representations within that media, right, it's very phenotypically white, right, often blonde, green or colored eyes, right? And so that racial hierarchy and anti-Blackness is already manifested on screen, right, through the telenovelas we consume, etc.
Yes, and did you notice any of these patterns when it comes to generational differences and how Latinx Twitter discusses anti-Blackness?
Yes, yeah, so I would say that what we can consider more of like the woke, right? Like, I mean, that term is thrown out very loosely, but the more progressive sectors of Latinx Twitter tend to be younger generations, right? I wouldn't call it necessarily like a recent immigrant, but it seems to be more like the millennial and Gen Z generation that has grown up with this idea of pan-ethnicity, right? And I think questions a little bit more what Latinidad is, and is more connected with grassroots activism and typically more allied with like Black Lives Matter, Las Vidas Negras Importan. Yeah, so I do see those generational shifts there.
Yes, definitely. And as Latinx, do you think we should try to focus on issues that have been prevalent in Latin America first before working with our issues in the US?
Well, I mean, there are intersections, right? Like if we think about racism, right? It's not something that is just, that appears just in the United States, right? It's a legacy that we have from our parents, right? If you were born here, right? Or that we even learn as the US is a white supremacist nation, right? Like we know that, we've seen it, right? And so I don't think that there's a separation in terms of that, right? There's intersections in terms of immigration policy, right? And activism surrounding that. It's a Latin American issue because if there's economic factors happening that are pushing people violence, right? It's a US based Latinx issue when you get here. So I don't think there's a full separation of that. There's a lot of transnational connections that happen there. Yeah, and even if we think about, if we were to replicate the logic of like Oscar so white and black, or like, you know, that type of rhetoric, we would say, oh, we always see immigration as a Latinx issue, as a brown issue, right? But even that separation is faulty. When we look at a lot of immigrants being Black immigrants, right? Or we just assume, right, that it's only Latinx. There are Black Latinx that are immigrants. And so I think they're just intertwined, and I don't necessarily see that separation.
Yes, definitely. And what do you think is your opinion on the need for representation regarding different Latinx nationalities?
Yes, yeah, so a lot of US Spanish language media has centered a lot of Mexican, right, national or like Mexican American communities in terms of representation, a little bit Cuban representation here and there. But as some of the tweets point out, right, we don't see a lot of Afro-Latinx representation. Indigenous representation is completely lacking, or if there is, right, it reproduces stereotypes. In terms of English language media, I would say that Netflix is slowly starting to make certain advances when it comes to that, right? So if we think of like On My Block, Gentefied, right? The One Day at a Time. So it's balancing, I think, that like ethnic specificity for a broader Latinx audience. But we've seen that the issue is that these texts don't travel well, they're not marketable to Latin America, and therefore they get canceled, right? Like One Day at a Time. But I think lately more and more, I just question like what we mean when we say Latinx representation, right? Because it's who are we leaving out? Who are we centering when we do that? It's a controversial topic, I think.
Yes, and what do you think is the main cause that communities are against the use of the term Latinx? I know in my own experience in Guatemala, that term is not appropriated yet. And when I try to have these conversations, it's interesting just to see the points of view on how this term is being adopted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to point out that Latinx don't exist in Latin America, right? Like you don't go to like Argentina, or you don't go to Guatemala and someone's gonna be like, yes, I am Latinx. Like that tends to be, it's a US based construct. It's still a colonial construct, but it's a US based construct, right? So that terminology, I think, doesn't apply to Latin American countries, right? However, you are seeing a move towards embracing gender non-binary, agender language, even in Latin America, right? So I've seen, for example, in places like Argentina, the use of the X or the E, Latine, I mean, they don't let amigues instead of amigos or amigas, right? Amiguex. I think it's really reassuring to see that movement growing. And in the US, the movement towards the X coming from queer, gender non-binary, agender communities to create a language that is more inclusive of their identities. So I think it's going to take time for it to be accepted, right? When you're talking about identities that are not heteronormative or like conform to gender norms, right? There's always going to be pushback. But the decision falls on us, right? Do we respect and value queer and gender non-binary and agender people? And do we want to adopt that, right? Or are we not comfortable with that language and we want to identify in whatever way we do? And so it's a personal decision, but I think we also need to think about the investments, right, behind those decisions.
Yes, absolutely. And we have Crystal asking, The Oscar-dominating Mexican trio of Alejandro González, Guillermo del Toro, and Alfonso Cuarón won the Academy Awards Best Picture in 2014, 15, 18, and 19, thus skewing the perceptions of Latinx representations at the Oscars. So did you see any conversations on Latinx or Black Twitter between American and US Latinx talent in the industry?
Yeah, not necessarily surrounding Oscars So White, but there are wider conversations on Twitter about these topics. And I think within, the last decade, I think you see more of that push, right? We are talking about US-based Latinx and US-based representation, not necessarily Latin American representation and Latin American content, right? That doesn't mean that we can't celebrate, right, and uphold those practitioners, media makers, right? That representation, it's amazing, it's great. We have Yalitza Aparicio because of that, right? Who's right here in the background, yeah, I mean, her picture. But the industries have often overlooked the participation of US-based Latinx, favoring Latinx, Latin American representation in the media. So I think we're starting to see slowly changes to embracing US-based Latinx creators.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question. What is your advice for media content producers in the current climate we are facing?
Media content producers, and okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a creator myself, but I mean, I think coming at it from Latinx media studies, right, and some of like the audience studies side of things, I think that there is a need and a want, a craving for authentic Latinx representation and authentic, what is authentic, right? But I think we have a sense for it, right? There's a difference between content that you can see is not written for us, not written by us, versus content that centers our creators, that centers our talent, that really engages with our stories and the nuances of our stories without tapping into stereotypes, right? And so I look at the example of Gentified, right, on Netflix, these two great Latinx creators who are telling hard-hitting stories about what it is to grow up as Latinx, Latin American, or immigrant in Boyle Heights, right? And the tough realities of that. It's not the sweet picture of the American dream, right? It's topics of, economic disadvantages, gentrification in your neighborhood, homelessness, and what that looks like. And I think those are the stories that are grabbing us more and more.
Thank you, Arcelia. Thank you, Valerie. This has been absolutely fascinating. Valerie, thanks so much for great moderation. Arcelia, thank you so much for a spectacular presentation. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for staying with us to the end. I want to invite you to attend next week's seminar with Mary Beltran of UT Austin. And since Arcelia mentioned Yalitza Aparicio, the one after that with Gillian Weiss actually will focus in part on Aparicio's case. So very, very timely mention and great actually visual in the background, Arcelia. So I hope everybody has a great rest of your days and weeks, and see you next week here at the new installment of the Latinx digital seminar series here at Northwestern. Thank you.